All right, we're going to get started on this next panel. Is equality under the market possible? Capitalism and social justice. And I'm very lucky to have two members of actually United for Social Justice, which is an immigrant rights organization here in Utah. First, we have Mark Alvarez. He's a licensed attorney in Utah and Maryland. In 2003, the Utah State Bar recognized him as the pro bono lawyer of the year. Mark has written numerous op-eds for the Standard Examiner and the Salt Lake Tribune. On Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, he co-hosts a Spanish-language radio show, Posto Latino, with Tony Yapies. Earlier this year, the University of Utah College of Social Work presented him with a Pete Suazo Social Justice Award in the area of community leadership and advocacy. And again, I know him personally, and he's a close friend. And he is always the first into the breach of any violation of immigrant or worker rights. So that's Mark Alvarez. Next, we have Mindy Hatch, who received a graduate with a master's in cultural anthropology and social transformation. Her research and fieldwork is based on the religization of Salt Lake City and the formation of the city along race, class, and gender difference in the historical present. Currently, as part of various social groups in the city, she is working towards collaborative scholarship and takes an advocacy stance. And again, a great social activist working on especially immigrant rights and oppression of both immigrants and prison oppression. So again, two of my, if you could put your hands together for two friends of mine, Mark Alvarez and Mindy Hatch.
You're closer.
This works as well. I guess can you come closer? I hope this is, we're going to each speak for 10 to 15 minutes, and I may actually be shorter than that. But I'd much prefer to have a conversation with all of you, and then to just roll off a 15-minute speech. I think proximity helps.
So seating is now obligatory.
Seems that way.
I apologize for the sense of order. I really liked, and I'm going to butcher the name, but is it Michael Parenti?
Yes.
Okay. Or Dr. Michael Parenti?
Yeah, I've been for a while.
I like that. I like the line, government cares what people are thinking, because when I've worked in politics a bit, and it seems like people in politics are so interested in positioning themselves rather than truly addressing issues. And they are paying attention to what we think. They're certainly paying attention to polls, to market studies that show that certain words, certain language will attract support. Capitalism, I guess can equality exist in a capitalist system? For me, capitalism is hard to define. According to the Oxford American College Dictionary, capitalism means an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit. The Wikipedia definition is an economic system in which the means of production are privately owned and operated for profit, usually in competitive markets. We need to define terms. What does competitive markets mean? We work in a system, and in the United States we think of as a capitalist, a free market system, and yet 25% of government spending is on weapons. There's something, defense spending could be called war spending. How does that affect how capitalism, how free market works? Particularly when big defense contractors seem to be in bed with politicians making a decision on how to spend the money. Social justice is the idea of creating a society or institution that is based on the principles of equality and solidarity, that understands and values human rights, and that recognizes the dignity of every human being. A Wikipedia entry suggests that it involves economic egalitarianism, through progressive taxation, income redistribution, and property redistribution. Again, the challenge is the definition of terms. I think capitalism is very difficult to define. People will define it differently. In the healthcare system, people like to talk about healthcare, especially Obamacare has become a pretty popular term. Check it out on a Google search, you get a lot of hits. What does Obamacare address? $1 in $2 spent in healthcare are spent by the US government. Is that truly a free market, a capitalist system? There's a question. 1 out of every $6 in the United States economy is spent on healthcare. I may make some enemies, but I'm going to use the example of Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher is known as a champion of capitalism. One writer characterized the driving force behind Thatcher's democratic capitalism as moral and social, not just in an economic sense. It encourages a range of virtues. Though Thatcher believed that capitalism worked, she did pose the question, it works, but is it moral? How many American capitalists and American politicians would even think to raise that question? Capitalism may or may not work. There are certainly a lot of critiques of capitalism, but is it moral? To whatever you think of Margaret Thatcher, that is a question she posed. In her book, Statecraft, Thatcher wrote something else. It is important in matters of high politics to know what you do not know. Though those who think that they know, but are mistaken, and act upon their mistakes, are the most dangerous people to have in charge. Seems like Thatcher wrote about American politics over the last decade. Going back to the Bush administration, and especially the decision to go to war in Iraq, we remember, I think the two professors spoke about this earlier, what were some of the reasons given to the American people for going to war in Iraq? Obviously Saddam Hussein's Hitler, but there are weapons of mass destruction. I still remember being in a demonstration against going to war in Iraq, and a woman was screaming, and it was some of my friends, and I said, well, instead of screaming back, let's ask her what her concerns are, why she's so angry with us. We have to go to war against Iraq because that's where Osama bin Laden is from. I just asked, I said, let's not get angry with her. Do you really think that Osama bin Laden is from Iraq? This woman did, as I'm sure you know, from Saudi Arabia. Perhaps the same argument could be turned around to Margaret Thatcher. Were people acting who thought they knew and didn't know and compounded mistakes and kept saying, we're right, we're going in the right direction, stay the course? In the 1980s, I used to run with some professors at the University of Maryland. We sometimes spoke about capitalism. I still remember a history professor, not my professor, I went to Penn State, but a history professor, Keith Olson, said, we all know there's something wrong with capitalism. The challenge is, what's the alternative? And unfortunately, this is a conversation I had in the late 80s. Unfortunately, over the last 25 years, in my mind, I'm not clear on what the alternative is, but that's the challenge. We all know there's something wrong with capitalism. I still have more questions than I do answers. Would wiser and tighter regulation of markets work? How do we deal with mixed economic systems, like I mentioned the healthcare system earlier, or a defense spending system, a weapons system, that allows big contractors to take really our money, to take the money of people who are paying into the federal government, the taxpayer money, and money that really at some point belongs to the society. Again, a healthcare system to which the government contributes about half the dollars is not a free market system. Can capitalism handle winners? I think this is an important question. Can capitalism handle winners? Those people and companies that succeed in a system, this may be true in any system, often have an incentive to keep others from competing. How do we handle that? Policies should be careful not to tamp down hard work, ingenuity, and innovation, but at the same time, they should not perpetuate extraordinary wealth concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. Real-world example, Bill Gates. I have nothing against Bill Gates. I respect what he did in having the idea to go out and try to found his company and start Microsoft. Now, there may have been others in the same situation, and maybe some of the way he succeeded doesn't seem fair to us. But I have no problem with somebody going out and starting something on his or her own. But should we allow that to, should the government have a policy structure that allows a company that's formed by somebody like Bill Gates to slowly but very steadily increase its power to the point at which it rules an entire industry and starts using a market power in other industries as well? Privatization of public assets is an issue. Carlos Slim is the richest man in the world. He's from Mexico. He may or may not have started with some wealth, and he may not have had some ingenuity. But a lot of his wealth came from, in the 1990s, a privatization of the telephone companies. Telmex was sold off by the Mexican government. Carlos Slim was one of the buyers. How does that work in a capitalist system? That seems, even if we look at pure capitalism and look at people taking risk and being rewarded for contributions, perhaps for the risks that are taken, that's false capitalism as a cause of the Mexican government. Salman Rushdie, and I'll go quickly to immigration. I'll speak for maybe 3 or 4 more minutes. Immigration is an issue I've been involved in for a long time. And I've spoken at UVU about immigration reform. It's needed. Really, a broken immigration system is causing real problems in our economic system, and it's holding people down. Salman Rushdie said, "I had become very interested in happy endings, knowing how difficult they were to achieve." So Salman Rushdie wrote the Satanic Verses. There was a fatwa issued against him. Immigration, though, is not the only issue for Latinos. In surveys, Latino voters have consistently expressed concern for jobs, better schools, affordable health care, and improved economy. Economics counts. A Pew Hispanic Center survey published in July indicated that the median net worth of Latinos declined 66% from 2005 to 2009. The decline was 16% for non-Latino white households. Much of the problem is attributable to the housing crisis. Pew Hispanic Center indicated that Latino homeowners saw their equity cut in half over that time. Jobs are a problem. Bureau of Labor statistics from August of this year indicate an unemployment rate of 9.1%. It's 11.3% for the Latino community. We start talking about the immigrant community, depending on documented or undocumented, it goes up even higher. In 2010, Latinos represented 15% of the labor force. In 2018, Latinos will be 18% of the labor force. Clearly, Latinos are an important part of the economy. Immigrants as well, even undocumented immigrants. Undocumented immigrants are 1 in 19 workers in the U.S. economy. Something wrong in our system of immigration and our system of accepting people from diverse communities has to change. We know the reality. Mediocre growth and financial imbalances affect everyone, but a politics that values positioning over solution is leaving underlying problems unaddressed. Seemingly limitless wasteful programs continue without sufficient controls. Harmful laws and regulations are not revised or undone. The annual budget deficit exceeds $4,200 per person. When we look at taxpayers, that figure goes up to around $10,000. The national debt exceeds $46,000 per person. This suggests an urgent need for action. On the taxing side, many people illustrate Senator Russell Long's saying, "Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that fellow behind the tree." That's important because even when we look at how to reform capitalism or whether to try to throw capitalism over, what is it that we're doing? And are we acting in the best interest of the entire society? Or are we essentially showing the truth of that statement? don't hurt you, don't hurt me, hurt that person behind the tree, that's always an issue. The Social Security system has long been considered a third rail. Suggest possible reductions and forget election. The problem is clear, there shouldn't be any third rails. I thank you to the Revolutionary Student Union because I think it is important to discuss how do we reform this society? And do we, sometimes there's a discussion, do we need transition or do we need rupture? We know, I think we all know we want to go away from the capitalist system, certainly as it exists today in the United States. But how do we move away from it? Do we do so in gradual fashion or do we need a rupture? And what Michael Minch suggested, though he didn't suggest, about having SUVs going up on May 1st of 2012, that in a sense is a rupture. But is it important to talk about? I think it is. And I think the university is a perfect place to talk about that. But serious approaches, we need to keep everything on the table. Last point. In April, Representative Christopher Murphy proposed H.R. 1354, the American Jobs Matter Act of 2011. It would allow contracting officers to consider information regarding domestic employment before awarding a federal contract. If the government is going to spend public money and a company is going to receive that, the companies aren't going to, they're not going to say no to money that's green. And when they receive that money, should the government be encouraging those companies to create jobs here in the United States? Seems fair. Wise policy certainly seems to indicate that we should encourage people who are getting government money to spend it for the better benefit of the society and perhaps to create jobs here. Big corporations block the measure. Big defense contractors. They want the freedom to move the money overseas so they can exploit cheaper and cheaper labor. It is unfair that Wall Street banks and certain corporations benefited most from the government bailout, from government spending. Yet assessing blame doesn't solve the problems, nor will pretty words and promises. One of the things I think we need in our politics, we need politicians who are going to tell us which promises they're going to break. I don't care, don't promise me anything, don't come to me with pretty words. What promises are you going to break? And maybe not promises that politician personally has made, but we are an overpromised society at this point. And whether it be abandoning certain capitalist models in industries, whether it be going for a gradual transition or a rupture from our system now, promises are going to have to be broken. And we as people, individuals and collectively, we have a responsibility politically to stand up and say, no, basta ya, in Spanish, enough already. Tell us which promises you're going to break. John Dewey, an American master of pragmatism, once wrote, our idealism is probably the loudest and most frequently professed philosophy the world has ever heard. Difficult decisions must be made to keep that so. What should they be? Moving away from our capitalist system? Reforming it in some way? Should it be a gradual transition or should it be a rupture? I'll be happy to answer any immigration questions. Some people have heard my immigration talk so often that I want to do something a little different today. But capitalism, social justice. Before we go too far, let's start defining those terms. And let's also start challenging people who define those terms in order to get us to think exactly the way they want us to think in order to maintain themselves in power. I wrote it down somewhere. Dr. Michael Parenti's statement is great. Government does care about what we're thinking, but they care about what we're thinking in order to maintain a certain level of power. In challenging leaders to define more specifically the terms, we're challenging their power, but it's something we have to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. I'm glad you went first. I thought you did a good overview of to speak about this. It's a very broad, can be a very broad subject, but I'll pick off kind of where you left off in defining terms, because I think one of the main things that we need to talk about is equality possible in the market system is, first of all, what is equality? And this is a term we need to definitely think about. Equal to whom? What is the standard of equality? How do we measure equality? And is equality really what we should be working towards when we're working for social justice? And then again, these are questions that, due to time, I'll merely be able to brief on here. So hopefully these can be ongoing conversations, and as always, as we have action and practice through social justice, these conversations and things can change. So my proposal today, though, is how we in the global north think about equality is shaped by capitalism. One of the main tenets or assumptions, and for many, capitalism's best quality, is that it creates an equal playing field. The capitalist assumption is that everyone has an equal ability to compete in the market, equal opportunities for jobs, equal opportunities for education, equal ability for economic gains. So everyone is equal and has equal opportunities. Those who succeed just work harder. So then the main question is, again, do we have equality? Do we have an equal level playing field? The end of slavery has been historicized, memorialized as one of this country's first greatest social justice movements. However, slavery was not abolished due to a sense of moral right or moral wrong, but the North and South competing economies. The history of slavery, this economic competition, and its aftermath have left the playing field that's assumed to be equal, I would say drastically unequal. Prior to the Civil War, the North was experiencing a change in industry, shifting away from producing raw goods for Europe to a manufacturing economy. To meet the need of this growing manufacturing economy, European immigrants were being used as cheap labor, as they often are used. Big business, capitalism wanted and needed to expand and wanted to, as many of you know, move west and into other states as free states. They were worried that the southern states would start manufacturing and creating businesses and using slave labor, and even with their cheap labor, they could not compete with free labor. So with the South firing on Fort Sumter in April of 1861, white Northerners were quick to join the war. However, already fearful of job competitions with blacks and concerned with more competition from free blacks kept many men from enlisting. Congress enacted the draft in 1863 that unduly affected workers rather than wealthier men who could afford to pay $300 to exclude themselves from the draft. As continues today, workers of different races were pitted against each other for job competition. Blacks became the scapegoat and primary targets of the rioters' anger. Tens of thousands of white workers in New York, many of them recent immigrants, took to the street and brutally beat and murdered, including lynchings, every black person they could find. It's estimated that 400 to 1,000 blacks were killed, and a mob even attacking a black orphanage. The draft law riots and murders of blacks also took place in other northern cities. It was hot and I'm cold. And then Lincoln is historicized, memorialized in our country's narrative as a champion of rights. He's one of our great workers for social justice, for freeing the slaves. He stated in his inaugural address 2 months prior to the Civil War starting that slavery was legal under the Constitution and he had no intention or right to abolish it. He also promised to continue to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. For Lincoln and the majority of whites, black people were not equals, and He so stated in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. What then, he said, free them all and keep them among us as our underlings? What next? Free them and make them politically and socially our equals? My own feelings will not admit of this, and if mine would, we well know that those of the great mass of whites will not. So since making blacks equal to whites was out of the question, Lincoln's idea of keeping them among us as underlings is what took hold once slavery was eradicated. And what made this possible and has effects for equality in the present is the 13th Amendment, which states, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, where the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any other subject or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So what the 13th Amendment did was made slavery legal in prisons. So, in some sense, this was a win-win for both the North and the South economies. The North and the South competing economic systems mated, and their deformed and incestuous inheritance lives on in the prison system, where slavery continues to be legal and thankfully makes a profit. There is currently more black men in prison and in the system under probation than there were in 1850, according to a new book, which I've yet to read, but I want to, by Michelle Alexander, called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. This also means that we don't need to worry, as Lincoln did, about blacks being political equals, either. For in prison, and even after their release, they can no longer vote or serve on juries. I argue that this history continues to make the playing field uneven. And how this has continued since then has been Jim Crow laws of segregation, black women continuing to work domestically, which, because of capitalism, continues to be an underpaid occupation. A history of lynching after the Civil War was used as a tool to continue white supremacy, both socially, politically, and economically. And lynching continues today as capital punishment, where numerous studies, including reports by Amnesty International and ACLU, have shown that black men are disproportionately put to death than whites, particularly when the victim is white, and are often tried by all-white juries. And again, the disproportionate number of blacks who have been convicted of crimes also keep them out of performing jury duties, so lessening the chance of someone to be able to be tried by a jury of their peers. The war on drugs has also been targeted in predominantly urban areas, black areas, regardless that numerous studies have showed that whites use drugs at just the same rate, if not more. The drugs that white people usually use, cocaine, you don't get as long of a sentence as you do for using crack. So is there equality? Let's see. So I would say that what has been used as social justice is often what I would call assimilation and not equality. And I would argue that equality is not liberation and it is not freedom. I'm going to read this definition. Booker T. Washington, soon after, in the Jim Crow era, became one of the leading black leaders, and he understood that equality was a measurable amount, that it could be measured in dollar amount. Let's see. This book was about Ida B. Wells, who at the time was working really hard to expose the widespread use of lynching. Booker T. Washington, instead, the accumulation of wealth by African Americans would bring with it the rights, political and otherwise, to which they are entitled. The accumulation of property would not only earn blacks the right to vote, Washington maintained, it would give them the power to end lynching. Washington's advocacy of black self-help and industrial education reassured whites in both the North and the South that the Negro problem was largely the responsibility of the Negro. Unlike Douglas and Wales, that Washington did not rebuke this white South for using a combination of disenfranchisement, economic exploitation, and racial violence to all but re-enslave African Americans. Nor did he ask white Northerners to intervene in Southern affairs. Instead, he maintained that African Americans did not command respect among whites because they did not amount to anything. Instead of appealing to Northern whites for help, blacks needed to embrace hard work and a modest education designed to prepare them for industrial jobs. Not surprisingly, Washington's message proved far more attractive to white Americans than Wells' demand for equal rights and protection from white violence. Sorry, I need a drink. I've been a little sick and my throat's getting dry. So I would argue this, again, this push for equality, as Washington stated, it can be measured in dollar amount. And so that means for blacks to have freedoms and rights, they needed to assimilate into the capitalist machine and buck up and work hard. But what is liberation? What is freedom? Liberation is the ability for a group or for people to decide what freedom and desires looks for themselves. Oh, that's where did I write my little book that I liked? Sure, but liberation is the ability to choose one's own desire, embracing racial, individual differences, a struggle to define one's own values, what your own priorities, and determine your own fate. There's been many movements in this country that have tried that, and I guess not many, but the Black Liberation movement. It wasn't Black Equality movement because they understood that wouldn't be possible. And what the Black Panther Party did, and that isn't often talked about, is fed their community, offered health care services, especially particular health care issues that affected the Black community, did arts and education within the community, and that is a threat to an economy that wants to keep people working and low wages and not defining their own rights and own choice for themselves. I also think that these different, rights of immigration, issues of racism, due to capitalism, we tend to have a very individualizing scope. So then we see these issues as being separate. So it would mean, for me as a woman, as a white woman, to just focus on women's oppression, and not to see how other oppressions operate, especially operate under a capitalist system. So I think that one of the things we need to start doing is looking for these linkages, looking for how they operate under capitalism, because, for example, women's oppression is very similar, and equality has been enter the workforce, get a job. It doesn't question what is equality or what these things are. And I could have done the same speech, which I was asked to do, to look at women's rights, but I think it's important to look at these differences with these struggles, and I think it's important to have alliances across these differences, which is why I decided to focus on this today. Let's see, make sure. And so I guess just to the end, what happens to people who operate and want justice that operates outside of a capitalistic economy, what happened to the Black Panther Party movement, and to just continue thinking what is equality and how that relates to social justice and capitalism. Thank you.
I guess we're interested in what you have to think as well, or if you have any questions.
Well, Mindy, I like what you said about the North and South being competing economies. What do you think about the idea? And I think you sort of alluded to this, but perhaps less explicitly. I was looking for. Do you think that economic self-determination precedes or implies individual rights, especially for, say, black minority groups or undocumented workers?
Yeah, I mean, I think economic self-determination should definitely be, did you say impedes rights? I think it should be a right.
It implies.
Yeah,
it
implies
precedes.
rights. I think it should be, and I guess, and I was kind of alluding but got a little scattered at the end, but looking at people whose economic systems, especially large groups of people, like an individual one person going off the grid is nothing necessarily to worry about, but especially looking at like indigenous groups and movements throughout the world who don't produce for a capitalist economy and are actually oftentimes in the way because they're demanding the rights to their lands. So their rights to their own economic system then gets in the way of the capitalist society. So I believe that that is part of a fundamental right, but wouldn't necessarily be equality. So, because I think part of the difficulty with equality is if we are going to let people and groups have self-determination, choose their own economic system, then we're not able to, then they're not measurable, then they're not going to be equal. So that's kind of why I kind of even want to just throw out this whole idea of equality, because I don't, in some ways, think it's possible, if that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think at least me and a lot of people within the RSU have thrown the idea that it's the equality of opportunity that we should be striving for. And I speak subjectively, of course, not putting words in your mouth, because it's the idea that it would be more based on merit and sort of this invisible hand notion of, you're just lucky to be born into a economically more viable state. I don't know. Maybe we could throw that idea around, just the idea of equality of opportunity instead of equality like everyone has the same this and the same that, and the same, which is I think generally the notion. You know what I mean?
But it's especially in an age of colorblindness.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I don't know, I never responded. I'm not sure it's exactly on point, but there are about 11 million undocumented aliens in the United States. A large percentage of those are in the workforce. When I think of rights, I usually think of rights within the legal system. Those undocumented aliens are working either without papers or perhaps with papers that belong to somebody else, papers that have been invented. They're in a sense extra legal. I'll tell you, they're not going away. And so it's an interesting question. In a sense, the undocumented alien who finds an opportunity and it just continues with that opportunity and develops, that person's kind of determining his or her future. The problem is we have all these outdated bad laws that if the person brushes up against them, the person suffers very severe consequences. And so it's a real challenge for our society, because that population of 11 million, which is it's about 3 to 4% of the population, they're living in a sense extra legally. Are they determining in a sense their future? Yeah, they are, and they're going to continue to do so because this is a determined group of people, a hard-working group of people, enterprising group of people. People don't emigrate to other countries hoping to do poorly. They emigrate usually seeking to progress. Whether we like it or not, our legal system is completely out of whack with that.
Absolutely. Great. I'll probably shut up so everyone can talk more.
You're doing very well. Yeah, just following up with that, Mark, and so as well as Mindy, but how do you feel about the DREAM Act being such an important and contentious issue, especially in our state?
I have mixed feelings about the DREAM Act. I was very much against it. because of the military service provision. I think that the DREAM Act was away, and the Pentagon was one of the big pushers behind the DREAM Act in Washington. They're having trouble with recruiting. We're better, because when you're talking about the DREAM Act, you're talking about undocumented students, ages 18 to 25 more or less, expanding the years depending on which proposal you're looking at. You're looking at people who could serve in the military. I was very opposed to the DREAM Act. I actually have changed. I favor the DREAM Act, but it was a hard move for me to make. I favor the DREAM Act because I've had some undocumented students talk to me and say, we need it, it's something we want. We're being blocked at every point because we live extra legally in the United States. This is our hope of going in the right direction. And then actually a woman at the University of Utah challenged me. She said, maybe it's our challenge, if there are leaders among us, to encourage people to continue with their education so that they don't have to take the military route. So I favor the DREAM Act, but with a major pain that I think some will be sucked into military service and probably exploited. And it's the people who maybe are most vulnerable who will go that route. Not making a judgment against them. Every person is free to decide how he or she wants to decide. But I think it's sad that our society sets up vulnerable people for those very difficult choices.
I'd have to say that I agree, exactly with what you say. For me, it's not usually who continues to serve in the military for a long time history in this country is, poor, disenfranchised people for numerous reasons. Why I also feel, like you were saying, that this just feeds into the military. But again, for a person that has citizenship, I can't make that call. So I wouldn't want to block other people who, like Mark was saying, that see this as a viable option, especially when so many options have been, shut down. And with what we're dealing with political power, unfortunately, sometimes you have to, how do we go about this? How do we make these changes happen? There's also always that, just overturn the system, but oftentimes that can't happen. People can't wait, so I agree with Mark.
I'm actually curious, what is your position on the DREAM Act?
I'm actually torn. My biggest concern is I don't think this is a stopping point. There's so much momentum. I think, speaking personally, it's probably the most, I want to say revolutionary, but not out loud. It does have the most revolutionary potential in changing the current system of relations. And there's so much momentum built up that I'm worried that the DREAM Act gets passed, that's a miracle in its own right, and then the momentum dies. And to me, I'm worried about this being a curbing bill instead of something, that you get a little, you want more. And I would hope that would be the case. But I am worried about this curtailing a lot of the momentum and energy that such a great movement has.
I remember Senator Hatch was one of the original sponsors of the DREAM Act. I actually still remember meeting with a fairly big meeting. It wasn't a personal meeting with Senator Hatch, but some of his aides in pushing the DREAM Act. And I said something near that. I said, I applaud Senator Hatch's proposal as a step in the right direction. But that doesn't make him a friend of the Latino community.
Right.
And I said it for exactly the reason you just articulated. I feared that at that point, this is before a lot of the anti-immigrant stuff started popping up, but there was movement, there was momentum to get comprehensive immigration reform. I feared, and this is cynical, but I was cynical towards Senator Hatch, still am, and more so today than I was then, that was just a measure to block more comprehensive reform. Let's go for the low-hanging fruit. Everybody is sympathetic to these young people who were brought here as young children who are studying and are going to contribute to the economy. He going for the low-hanging fruit to avoid addressing the problem in a more comprehensive way. This country needs to deal with 11 million people who are undocumented. Whether they like it or not, even Republicans are starting to come around on the issue. They're going to have to deal with it. And kicking 11 million people out of the country is not possible. So for me, I'm going to label it cynicism on my part, but I share that concern. That the DREAM Act maybe is a way to block something that's more comprehensive and maybe more social justice.
I have a question, and it's kind of an abstract question, and it's related to the previous talk with Dr. Parenti. Maybe the three of you and everybody can talk about it, but it has to do with either or methods or goals, depending on the way you look at it, and kind of the idea that the American, well, the leftist movements in the United States have in recent history moved to the particular and not the universal, to some may say identity politics, and the idea. Oftentimes I hear that in terms of, it's often phrased as methods that appeal to people's self-interest. I guess it's not a very concise question, but my feeling is that appealing to self-interest results in the particular, results in fragmented groups seeking their own well-being or their own liberation, and not resulting in a universalist struggle. But I'm interested in your thoughts about that.
I know certainly and unfortunately sometimes Latino leaders, of which I consider myself an ordinary person. I do speak, I guess, I have a radio show in Spanish, and so I do reach a certain percent of the Spanish-speaking population. But sometimes we fall into that trap of not seeing that LGBT rights, those are important. That equal pay, gender equity, that some other issues are important. And I think it may go, I'm kind of curious if Dr. Parenti has some ideas on this. I think that has to do with how some people in power almost try to institutionalize us so that there's not kind of cross-fertilization. You know, I gave a speech at Pride last year, and I said, Latinos don't. I was in 1993. I was actually at the march, and I can't remember exactly what it was called, but the March for Gay Rights in Washington D.C. I'm a member of the bars of both Utah and Maryland, and I lived for a long time in Laurel, Maryland, which is near Washington D.C. Was there, 1993. We're going for equal rights, right, LGBT issues, and people say, well, Latinos, they're not there yet. You know, we're all moving, but Latinos aren't there yet. I lived in Valencia, Spain. I actually went from 1993 to 1996. I went to a wedding of two gay men at a bar. At that time, it's unofficial, Spain now has marriage equality. Mexico City has marriage equality. Argentina has marriage equality. Don't let anybody say that Latinos are slow in these issues. Institutions of power and people in power have done what they can to say, to divide us so that we don't cooperate across these issues. For me, immigration issues, they're human rights issues. I don't care if somebody's Latino, Asian, Chinese, Canadian, it's a human rights issue. So are LGBT issues, as are gender equity issues. I don't know, I've spoken a little longer. I wanted to see if...
No, and I mean, I definitely agree, you know, and I tried to hit on this at the end too, like what is it that makes this individualizing force that makes us just look at these different things so separated? Because then if we did see, you know, LGBT, you know, for example, issues is often an issue of immigration. And even if it isn't, with, you know, we work to come together across different races, different sexualities, different genders, then we have enough people for what they were talking about before, for like millions to strike and march. It's when we become fragmented. When we start looking at the movements and history of social justice movements in this country, from the beginning, from the abolitionist movements to then white women working for the right for them to vote, it has become very fragmented along the way. We have a history of this, particularly in this country, so it's not anything new. So I think it's really important. For me, part of the work is, part of social justice work is to make these connections and to make these alliances and not just to make them just single-focused issues. And it's a long history in this country of doing that.
You know, maybe something else, I think it may go to touch back on capitalism. Brown v. Board of Education, some of the civil rights movements. There are some people who have suggested that reforms in those areas came about because the United States had to clean up its image. It actually came about as a defense of capitalism. And so, I've given actually some arguments, and I make arguments for immigration reform. I'll continue to make these because I think it's important to just keep making good arguments. But I would worry if all of a sudden kind of capitalist, very powerful people got it, that we're going to start standing for the reform now as well, to maybe perpetuate a system that ensures the continuation of social injustice. Good example, Utah's immigration solution. Utah's immigration solution, where we're going to give guest worker permits to undocumented workers living in the state of Utah. Who was behind that? Sutherland Institute, Chamber of Commerce. Why are they behind it? They know there will be a strain on Utah's workforce if the economy gets going to a certain degree. There are stresses in agriculture, Park City, the resorts, the hotels. So you may have heard about the Grand America recently having had to lay off about 120 people because of documentation problems. Grand America's had a hard time filling those positions. And so they may try to co-opt immigration and looks like social, I'd be happy, I want that, but I don't want that to happen so that social injustices can be perpetuated. I have that kind of rolling back to your question.
Then how do you do it? That's a problem I've had about it. When George Bush and I are both on the same side for immigrant rights, but he's doing it to deflate wages to keep a cheap labor supply, then there's a question of economic justice that comes into conflict. And how do you resolve that? We've had 40 years of identity politics and cultural politics, but the class issues have often been just overlooked. And by class, I don't mean sociological categories, upper, middle, lower. I mean class power issues of expropriation of wealth, abuse of labor, and exploitation, and all of that. I haven't been able to resolve it in terms of immigration. You've done a lot of terrific work in that area.
Well, I think one way to do it is that now I heard one of the Republican presidential candidates, actually a lot of them are repeating this line now, we're for legal immigration. We're just against illegal immigration. Well, that's class warfare. That's class warfare because the great majority of people who are here without documents had no legal way to come here. They had no official way to come here. And that's mostly true for people who don't have as much education. The undocumented community is very diverse, from the very, very highly educated people to people who have very little education. But in going after, we're against illegal immigration. They're against the people, frankly, Mitt Romney is one. He had 2 undocumented people working on his lawn. And yet the hypocrisy of his standing.
They all do. They all got nannies and house cleaners.
That's one. Another thing is that our immigration system is very skewed to highly trained professional workers. We have visas open for those workers. We don't have visas open for the people who are going to work in Mitt Romney's yard, or work maybe in the hotels where he stays. He doesn't see them because they come in. They're like the invisible workers who come in and do the cleaning. We need to adjust our laws so that all work is respected. One of the problems we have now is that highly skilled workers, those who look nice, they're welcome. Maybe people who don't come from as privileged a background or who are doing work that's important in our economy, they're not welcome. I don't know if that's the way to do it. I think that's one way. I also think it's very important when somebody speaks English with an accent, we should applaud. Good for an adult who's learned a foreign language. When somebody's working hard and contributing in whatever way, that should be the argument for immigration reform. It should be the dignity of the human being, not the need for Grand America to have cheap labor. Not the need for capitalism to have its, you said it better than I did, but maybe it's quasi-slave labor. or it's very cheap, humble labor. That's not the reason for immigration reform. The reason for immigration reform is we should respect the dignity of each human being. That's what I don't think George Bush did. I may be wrong, but the way immigration reform need is phrased from the right is all about having that cheap labor force available here. I hope that's a start anyway.
Yeah, they have enough pickers when the harvest is coming.
Yeah. Well, I see that Professor David Knowlton, who's a great speaker, great person, is here, and I think he's starting at 3.
So do we want to wrap it up? Are there any final questions? All right, then let's give this wonderful panel a hand.